All right. Welcome everyone to our fiscal briefing, a joint hearing between the House Appropriations Committee, Senate and Budget Taxation Committee. We're joined by our Senate colleagues, Guy Gazzone, Chair. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Glad to be here, ready to go.
All right. I think we'll start with Dave Romans, who will walk us through the fiscal briefing. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we're going to share the document on the screen. So for those of you who are new to this, the fiscal briefing is meant as a high-level overview of the governor's proposed budget. Most of the focus will be on the state's general fund and the outlook for the general fund. We do touch briefly on a number of other topics, including personnel, capital, transportation, and local aid. And there will, of course, be many analyses digging deeper into all the issues raised here as we go on in the session. So we're going to start out with this quick look, which is a few pages that I'm going to present here at the start that gives you a real high level overview, and then we'll dig into some of those other topics in more detail. As you can see, the overall budget actually decreases by 1.1 billion, almost 2% in fiscal 24. And that's because general funds and federal funds are actually declining. The federal funds is pretty easy to explain. That's a lot of federal stimulus money that was in the 23 budget that's starting to dissipate. For example, the enhanced Medicaid match we've been getting for a number of years will drop off over the course of fiscal 24. So that's what's kind of driving the decline in the federal funds. In the state general funds, some of it is we have a little bit less surplus than we had available last session. Also, we're making a much smaller appropriation to the rainy day fund. Last year, you put over $2 billion into the rainy day fund. This year's budget plan puts nothing into that. If you exclude that money that's going into a savings account, the budget actually grows on the general fund basis by about 4% and overall by about 2%. So in terms of fiscal 24, the governor is leaving a proposed fund balance of $820 million, which is one of the larger fund balances we've seen in a proposed budget. I think part of the rationale for that is to help hedge against the recession, the concerns that everyone has about whether the high interest rates are going to send us into some sort of mild recession. In addition to the 820 million, there's $2.5 billion in the state's rainy day fund. That is equivalent to 10% of general fund revenues. So overall, you have between the general fund and the rainy day fund, 3.3 billion in cash reserves, about 13% of general fund revenues. We've generally believed that at least 10% is a good number to help us muddle through the first couple of years of recession. So we are in a pretty strong position to combat a recession when it arises. One thing to note, just in terms of the federal funds, we highlighted in the bold there, is that there's quite a bit of competitive grant money coming from the Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and from the Inflation Reduction Act. And when I say quite a bit, I'm talking potentially billions of dollars. Since a lot of the competition is underway or hasn't even started, that money, of course, is not in the budget. But at some point in the future, we may see some of that money added to the fiscal 24 budget. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so I call your attention to that chart in the middle of this page. One of the things we wanted to highlight for you is that while the governor leaves an 820 million general fund balance, much of the spending and revenues that get us down to that level is tied to legislation. Before accounting for the legislative package, there's actually a $1.3 billion general fund balance. And let me just hit the highlights here of the legislative package. On the revenue side, the governor's proposed 3 areas of targeted tax reduction. One is that back in 2021 session, you temporarily enhanced the earned income tax credit, allowing people to qualify for a larger refundable credit. That will expire in the next tax year. The governor is proposing to extend that enhancement, and that includes extending the coverage of people who lack a social security number when they apply. That would cost about 151 million of general fund revenues under the governor's estimate. Second piece is to exempt military retirement income from the income tax. The state currently exempts 15,000 up to 15,000 for people over the age of 55 and up to 5,000 for folks under the age of 55. This would substantially exempt much greater amount of the income. We have not seen the bill yet, so we don't know all of the specifics. That would cost about 33 million. And then the governor is proposing an enhancement to the state's child tax credit, which currently serves very few people because it's limited to families with an income below $6,000, and that has to be for disabled children. Again, we haven't seen all the details of who would be covered under the governor's plan, but the administration is estimating a $20 million revenue loss. So all told, about $204 million in revenue losses tied to these tax changes. Then there's quite a bit of spending that is tied to legislative actions. The largest item is accelerating the $15 minimum wage effective date from calendar 25 to October of this year, as we understand it. In the statute, when the minimum wage was first going up to $15 was first passed, the General Assembly provided rate increases to most healthcare providers to help them, raise their salaries to keep pace with the minimum wage. And what the governor is proposing to do that spends the $218 million you see there is that he's accelerating all those planned rate increases that were supposed to happen in fiscal 25 and 26 into 24, so they align with his new schedule for the minimum wage. So that'd be about as a result of that, providers will receive an extra 8% rate increase if you pass the proposal as the governor has suggested. Reducing the hospital assessment. So Maryland has a assessment on hospitals that is used to help fund our state Medicaid program. It generates $394 million a year for the Medicaid program. The governor is proposing for 1 year only to provide $50 million of relief on that assessment. And then he backfills that with general funds to keep the Medicaid program whole. There's some other legislation that we don't have a lot of details on. The Educator Shortage Act is some sort of teacher recruitment initiative that would cost $15 million. And the Innovation Economy Infrastructure Act would cost about $10 million. So those are the big expenditure items. All told, they add up to about $305 million. And then finally, there's about a little over $61 million of savings tied to some legislation that would cut the budget. When the state has a big surplus like we did in the end of fiscal 22, the part of that money gets swept into the rainy day fund in the next legislative session. So the governor was required to put $1.061 billion into the rainy day fund. He has a budget reconciliation and financing act that would relieve that mandate. We wouldn't have to put the $1.061 billion into the rainy day fund. He's proposing to simply cut $61 million of it. The other $1 billion helps fund two big enhancements, $500 million into a reserve account for transportation capital needs, and $500 million to be transferred to the Blueprint Fund, which is the state's primary mechanism for funding the Kerwin Education Reform Initiative. So those are that's sort of the legislative package and its impact on the budget. Let's go to the next slide. All right, I think that the biggest takeaway in this entire presentation today is probably this chart here. It looks at what the state's structural budget outlook. So what that is comparing is ongoing revenues compared to ongoing spending in the governor's plan. The blue bar shows you what the administration has included in its in the appendix in the budget highlights, and they show a healthy balance in the general fund. But that's before you take into account their estimates of a deficit in the Blueprint Fund. The Blueprint Fund would not have enough money under their estimates to cover all of the Kerwin costs in fiscal 27 and 28, which would likely mean that those costs would have to be borne by the general fund. And that results in a structural budget gap for fiscal 27 of almost $1 billion, and for fiscal 28 of $1.2 billion. So while there's quite a bit of capacity in fiscal 24 for additional structural spending, you can see we're going to have some significant challenges as a state going forward unless revenues improve or the legislature takes some actions to reduce spending or provide additional revenues to address the challenges. Now, for those of you who are on the Spending Affordability Committee, you will recall back in December that we presented a very rosy structural budget outlook that did not have any sort of structural deficit through fiscal 28. And if you turn to the next slide, we explain what happened. Can we skip ahead, please? So the single biggest explanation of what happened is that the number of students in the public schools who are qualifying for free and reduced price meals from this fall is 111,000 more than last fall. And that's not because there was a huge increase in enrollment in the public schools. It's because more of the students who are there are being captured as free and reduced price meal. That 110,000 people translates into a significant increase in our compensatory education formula, which is driven by the number of students who are free and reduced price meals. Compensatory ed grows by 390 million in this year's budget, just following the formula. And then that would be an ongoing cost. So that's why the budget outlook in the out years is so much worse, is that we have this huge ongoing cost that has appeared, and it kind of drains the blueprint fund much faster than was expected. So you might ask how we ended up with so many more students in this category. The major change is that for the first time, the state matched the public school enrollment numbers against Medicaid enrollment for kids. And they identified a substantial number of children who are in Medicaid and are low income, who are eligible for the free and reduced price meals. That had never been done before. And that accounts for the surge. And later in the document, we show county by county, almost every county in the state saw a huge surge in their free and reduced price meal numbers, 20% or more in most counties. It's only those jurisdictions that already had an extraordinary number of students in free and reduced price meals, like Baltimore City and some of the poorer jurisdictions on the Eastern Shore, that didn't see a big bump up in their student counts in free and reduced price meals. All right, we can go to the next slide. All right, so the other thing that we talked about in December with the Spending Affordability Committee was we were projecting about a $3.6 billion cash surplus for fiscal 24, even after leaving 10% in the rainy day fund, and after funding all of the mandates and sort of expected costs for fiscal 24. So what this chart tries to do is show you, well, what happened to that 3.6 billion? How did the administration use it? Well, as I said before, they leave 820 of it aside in the general fund. The biggest area of spending is what I would call initiatives and enhancements, about $2 billion. I've touched on a number of these already: the transportation capital money being set aside, the transfer to the Blueprint Fund, the provider rate increases tied to the minimum wage, tax relief, and so forth. I'll just highlight a couple of other things in that chart. One is in public higher education. The university system, Morgan State, St. Mary's, and the community colleges all received more money than we were anticipating back in December. So there was some extra money for them. One of the more interesting things that we'll explore further in our budget analyses of the individual agencies is that there appear to be an opportunity for a lot of savings in the current year's budget, because vacancies in state employment are so high, 13% or more, and they were budgeted to be only about 7-8% of positions vacant. So there's a lot of excess money in the agency's budget that they're not using, for employees. So we think that there's a large surplus. The administration left that money in the budget. DLS had proposed taking it out back in December. So I think one of the questions is, what are the agencies going to do with that roughly $114 million that they're retaining in their budgets in the current year? Another interesting item is in behavioral health. There's 78 million for what are called infrastructure investments, but they're unspecified. And the idea is that the new leadership team at the health department would determine what the best uses of that money is. So I think I'm sure the committees will want to take a close look at what the plans are for that. One other thing I would mention here is there's K-12 education hold harmless money of $37 million. There were 2 school systems that would have received less total funding in fiscal 24 than in fiscal 23. So the governor provided a hold harmless. 32 million of that money goes to Baltimore City. 5 million goes to Allegheny County. And as a result, every jurisdiction receives at least what they did in fiscal 23. And you can see there's some other smaller initiatives that I'll let you peruse at your leisure. Then under the higher estimates of costs, there are certain areas where the administration just thinks kind of costs that the state had committed to are going to be higher than what were forecast back in December. One is in the Medicaid and behavioral health area, about 432 million higher spending across 2 years, across the current year and fiscal 24. A lot of that relates to estimates of higher enrollment. DLS will take a really close look at the administration's assumptions and where enrollment is over the next month or two, and we may or may not have some recommendations for you terms of whether that amount is too much or is the correct amount. There's also a substantial amount more than was expected in the cybersecurity area, implementing legislation from last session that asked the administration to set aside a substantial amount of money to address the state's cybersecurity needs. This is on top of more than 100 million that was set aside last session and has not yet been spent. So there's more than 250 million sitting in the dedicated purpose fund for cybersecurity. This is another area that we'll be taking a close look at and trying to better understand what the plan for spending that money over the next couple of years is. And then, as I mentioned, the last part is the 820 million reserved for the future. All right, so we can go to the next slide, please. All right, a lot of bullets here on sort of other highlights in the budget. A lot of it's there for you to look at your leisure. I would note a couple of items. In the third bullet, the healthcare provider rates. Even before taking into account that minimum wage change the governor's proposing, most healthcare providers will get a 4% rate increase in fiscal 24. If you pass the minimum wage bill as the governor is proposing, they would end up with a 12% increase in fiscal 24. And a couple of bullets down, the university system of Maryland and Oregon and St. Mary's also are all going to hold in-state tuition to 2% growth, in part because of the substantial funding that the state is providing them. And below that, community college aid by formula grows about 11% or $40 million in fiscal 24. In terms of employee compensation, the governor has put in $390 million into the 24 budget to raise state employees' salaries. All state employees will get at least a 2% cost of living adjustment. The law enforcement officers bargaining unit folks had agreed to a 5% increase back a year ago with Governor Hogan, and that is honored in the budget. There's also money for employee increments, which are essentially merit increases that most employees will qualify for in fiscal 24. And within that 390 million, there's roughly 30 million for targeted salary adjustments in certain areas where the state has particular difficulty in hiring. And we'll delve into those more in future analyses. There's also 623 million in this budget to pay for the 4.5% COLA that Governor Hogan provided to state employees effective November 1st of 2022. There was no money actually budgeted for that when the governor did that. So this budget provides both the money to pay for it in fiscal 23, as well as the ongoing costs of fiscal 24. And again, that amounts to a little over $620 million. Another interesting note is the governor has set aside $150 million for legislative priorities. So that's money that you would cut and then spend as you wish on your priorities, whether they be operating or capital. The governor's thought was 50 million is for operating, 100 million for capital, but it's really up to you all how you choose to utilize those funds. And then that last bullet on the page, in terms of the capital budget, the governor agreed with the Spending Affordability Committee and put 1.2 billion of general obligation bonds in for capital, and then supplemented that with $1.1 billion of general fund and special fund cash, the special funds coming from the Fiscal Responsibility Fund. Final thing I'm going to talk about on page 7 is these potential legislative issues. A lot of them I think are pretty obvious. You need to think about that long-term sustainability of the budget. You need to consider the governor's legislative package. As has been noted by many, the state has this huge problem with hiring and retention, and I think that'll certainly be a focus throughout the session. DLS will be focusing on whether the Medicaid and behavioral health funding amounts are at the right level. And then there's this question of all these competitive grants that the state will be pursuing, and a new administration coming into office, try to better understand what the plans are for applying for those grants and how they want to use that money. And then finally, this is the first year where the General Assembly has greater flexibility to reallocate funds in the budget. And that will certainly be a new experience for the General Assembly. Mr. Chairman, that's the really high level, big picture on the budget. If there are no questions at this point, I would be turning it over to Teresa Szynski. He'll give you a little update on revenues and the economy.
Dave, we do have a question. Before we get to that, I do notice that we are joined by Secretary Grady, so we want to welcome her. And she's been a great partner already. I know that Chair Gazone concurs. We've both been saying it all over town, so we'll say it again. Thank you, Secretary Grady, already, and welcome. Delegate Resnick has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a very quick question. David, thank you for the great presentation. With regard to the Medicaid rate increases, you said that almost everybody's going to get a 4% before the adjustment for the acceleration of minimum wage. But on the sheet, it says 3 to 4%. So do you have a sense of who's getting the 3 and who's getting the 4?
Yeah, by statute, the behavioral health mandated increase was 3%. Pretty much everybody else was mandated. All the Medicaid home and community-based services providers and PDA providers were mandated to get 4%. So the governor followed the statute.
Got it. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
And Delegate Smith?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a couple of blueprint related questions, if I may. You were discussing the increase in spending related to blueprint dollars, and I wondered if you could just unpack more some of those investments. I believe that is related to the increase around, universal pre-K access and some other priorities of the blueprint. I don't know if you could dig in a little deeper there.
I think we'll get into some of the detail on what's growing in the budget later on. We'll get into local aid. The single biggest item is compensatory education, which, as I said, rose $390 million, partly because of the blueprint changes, but largely because of that huge change in the students qualifying. The foundation program grows about $140 million, and then there's about $62 million of additional spending in special ed. And then the rest of it is sprinkled around concentration of poverty, grants grow. I mean, it almost all follows the blueprint formulas. And we do have a chart later on in the document that will show more detail.
Thank you, David. And what you're saying is that we're better identifying, I guess, those students who are low income.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Delegate. Delegate Mangione? He put his hand down, so maybe he didn't actually have a question. So I don't see any senators. Oh, he's back. Delegate Mangione.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just briefly, Mr. Romans, can you explain the very beginning? You said the budget was $1 billion less because of what with the federal funds? If you can just explain that again. Thank you.
Sure. As you all know, we've received a tremendous amount of federal kind of COVID relief and stimulus money over the last few years. And a lot of that money was used in fiscal 22 and in fiscal 23. So it starts to dissipate in fiscal 24. Two of the most notable changes are, for the last few years, we've been getting an extra 6% of our Medicaid costs covered by the federal government. They are phasing that out by December of this year. So we'll be back to the normal 50% federal match. So that's over $500 million decrease in federal funds. We also get a lot of temporary money for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, the food benefit program for low-income folks. There were, again, some temporary enhancements in federal law, and those go away, and that's another big contributor to the drop in federal funds.
Thank you.
Delegate Solomon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. David, thank you as always for the really informative presentation. Just quickly on the hold harmless piece with the school systems. So just to make sure that I understand, so there were districts where enrollment may have actually continued to stay low, especially compared to pre-COVID, but because in some of those districts we identified so many more students on free and reduced meals because of the Medicaid switch, the hold harmless is really unnecessary for those districts because they're being made whole through the increase in compensatory services. Is that right?
Right. I mean, most jurisdictions we're growing because of blueprint implementation, which phases things up. The comp ed huge jump because of the free and reduced price meals further brought most counties into significant growth. So it's just those two jurisdictions that don't see growth, and they have some unique things going on in each jurisdiction. That's why they're getting the hold harmless. Just as an example, in Allegheny County, they had someone win, I believe, the Powerball. So their wealth went way up for 1 year, which resulted in a big change in their education formula funding. So they qualify for the hold harmless, but that was kind of a unique one-time event.
Thank you.
Delegate Watson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to clarify again on the free and reduced meal students. So the increase of 110,000 is about 34% increase. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And why did we match the students, the Medicaid rolls? Is that something other states do, or how did that come about? Or why weren't we doing it before?
Well, it's something we'd never done. And when the blueprint legislation was passed a few years ago, one of the things that was included was the desire to start matching against Medicaid to make sure we were properly capturing all of our low income students. And this was the first year that they had the technology and the matching capability and were able to proceed with doing that.
Okay. And you said there was a county by county list, but I didn't see that in the handout. Is that, where can we find that?
Yeah, it's way in the appendices of the document, I believe.
Okay. I can find it online, I'm
You know,
sure.
when we get to local aid, I think Hiram Birch will highlight where that is in the document, but it is included somewhere. Apologize.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So the good news, David, is that matching this Medicaid enrollment has worked. We found the poor kids and we're getting money to them.
Exactly.
Okay. I don't see any questions from any senators. So Mr. Chair, chime in if you see anyone. If not, David, you can continue.
Yeah, I'm going to turn it over to Teresa Jasinski, who's going to talk to you about the economy and revenues.
Thank you very much. Starting here with the economy, we're going to just give you a little lay of the land of what happened with the Maryland economy in 2022. And we're going to start with the labor market. The first couple columns all deal with the labor market. The first column is the year-over-year percent change in employment in Maryland. So it's each month compared to the same month in 2021. So in January, employment was up 3%. For the year as a whole, Maryland employment was up 2.8%. That's about 74,000 jobs. The second column is comparing the employment level to the employment level in February of 2020, just before the pandemic began. Between February of 2020 and April of that year, when the pandemic began, the state lost a little over close to 403,000 jobs. That was about almost a 14.5% drop in employment. And since then, since April of 2020, we've been adding jobs. But you can see that as of December 2022, we still were 47,000 jobs below where we were when the pandemic began. Maryland is one of 26 states that have yet to fully recoup the jobs lost at the beginning of the pandemic. The US economy as a whole reached that milestone last August. The next column is the Maryland unemployment rate. At the beginning of the year, the unemployment rate was 5.4%. By the time we got to the summer, it had gotten down to right around 4. It drifted up a little bit in the fall, but it did come back down to 4% in December. For the year as a whole, and on average, we had a 4.4% unemployment rate. That actually ranks Maryland 10th. We have the 10th highest unemployment rate in 2022 among the other states and the District of Columbia. The US, by comparison, is at 3.6% for the year as a whole. So we have an unemployment rate that's considerably above the US. The next two charts relate to wage growth. What we've done here is taken total wages divided by the number of workers. Wage data is only available on a quarterly basis. So the data shown for March is the first quarter, the data shown for June is the second, and the data shown for September is the third quarter. We do not yet have data for the fourth quarter of 2022. So that calculation of wage per worker, the reason to do it is because part of what drives wages is just the employment growth. More people, wages are going to go up because you just have more people working. This gives you a better sense of actual kind of wage increase people are getting. It's running for the first 3 quarters of the year, 2.9%. Over 2021, the same period in 2021. That's actually not that different from the kind of wage per worker growth we saw prior to the pandemic. However, of course, inflation is considerably higher now than it was before the pandemic. And so the next column adjusts that data for inflation. And you can see that because of inflation, the wage per worker has actually fallen in inflation adjusted terms by about 5% in the first 3 quarters of the year. The inflation forecast below the chart is coming from the 2 companies the state contracts with to provide economic forecasts, Moody's Analytics and IHS Markit. You can see that in 2022, inflation in the US was 8%. They both project that inflation will come down to about 4% in 2023, and then a little over 2% in 2024. Inflation growth for the consumer price index of a little over 2% is really on line with the target of the Federal Reserve, which of course has been raising interest rates to bring inflation down all throughout 2022. And finally, the housing market, obviously a big story in 2022 has been the sharp decline in home sales. This is data from the Maryland Association of Realtors. You can see that for the year as a whole, home sales, this is existing home sales, not new home sales, fell 21.2%. But it's important to keep in mind that home sales in 2021 were at a record level. According to this data, there was over close to 107,000 home sales in 2021. That's far and away above any prior year in this series, which goes back to 1999. So the drop in some ways was off of a record high, but at about 85,000 sales in 2022, it was the lowest level of sales in Maryland since calendar 2016. The median home price, however, continued to increase despite the decline in home sales. And it really wasn't until December that home price growth flattened out. Obviously, the drop in sales is driven by a number of things, including very low inventory of homes for sale, those high prices, and of course, rising mortgage rates. As the Federal Reserve has been raising interest rates, mortgage rates have gone up substantially. They started 2022 at 3.2% for a fixed year 30-year mortgage. By the end of the year, they were at 6.4%. For a brief period in the fall, they had gotten over 7%. So those three things, low inventory, high prices, high mortgage rates, really hammers affordability and cut into the ability of people who maybe had the wherewithal to buy a house, but just couldn't afford to. Moving on now to revenues on the next chart. I should say before I leave this economics, keep in mind that all economic data is subject to revision. So this is the data as it appears right now, and throughout the year, we'll continue to get revisions and the picture could change somewhat. But moving on to revenues on the next chart, we're going to take a step back in time to fiscal 2022. Fiscal 2022 ended in June of last year, June 30th. And this chart compares the actual revenues to the estimate, as well as the comparison to fiscal 2021. In total, general fund revenues in fiscal 22 were over the estimate by about $1.6 billion. That's a 7% miss. The ongoing revenues were up about $1.5 billion and a 6.5% miss and about a 17.5% increase over fiscal 2021. The personal income tax accounts for the vast majority of this overattainment, about $1 billion, and it grew 15.7% over fiscal 2021. We collect the income tax in a variety of channels. The biggest by far is withholding from people's paychecks. That was up, but it was actually pretty close to the estimate. That wasn't really what drove the overattainment, nor were quarterly estimated payments. A lot of people who have income for which taxes are not withheld are required to pay quarterly estimated payments. That might be people who are self-employed, people with a lot of investment income, make quarterly estimated payments. That was actually slightly below the estimate. What really drove things was people filing their tax returns and paying as they filed their tax returns. And in fiscal 22, that was largely for tax year 2021. At the same time, refunds were below the estimate. So final payments were way above the estimate. Refunds were well below the estimate. And as a result, that's what really drove the overattainment in fiscal 22. When we see growth in the income tax coming from things like final payments, it's usually an indication that it's non-wage income that's really driving the revenues, and non-wage income is very volatile. And, for example, it's very likely that capital gains income was a significant driver of the personal income tax in fiscal 22. We have every reason to believe that in tax year 22, capital gains income fell as the stock market fell. So as we look to get tax returns for tax year 22, you would expect things to look quite different in terms of the growth in the personal income tax. The corporate income tax was over the estimate by $94 million. This was a combination of strong gross receipts and extremely low corporate refunds. Corporate refunds were just $140 million in fiscal 22, the lowest level since fiscal 2007. The sales tax was over by $268 million. About $65 million of that was due to legislation. There was legislation at the 2022 session that simplified the distribution of sales tax revenue to the Blueprint Fund beginning in fiscal 2023. However, the bill had a June 1st effective date, and as a result, it eliminated the distribution to the Blueprint in fiscal 22 for the last 2 months of the year. The estimate had only provided for a 1-month effect. So that was partly why the general fund did a little bit better than the estimate. There was also the case that online sales revenue, which is what goes to the Blueprint Fund or had gone to the Blueprint Fund under the old law, did a little bit better than expected. The sales tax was up 19.6%. That's obviously a pretty eye-popping growth rate. But it's important to keep in mind that fiscal 21 was the first full year of the pandemic. Fiscal 21 begins in July of 2020, and fully 3/4 of the year takes place before the widespread availability of vaccines. So we can think of the fiscal 22 growth as being a significant rebound from that first year of the pandemic. Moving on to the forecast on the next page. In this chart is comparing the Bureau of Revenue estimates, the Board of Revenue estimates, estimate for the general fund revenues from December, which they released last month, to their previous estimate in September. In September, the board put out a new estimate that raised their estimate of fiscal 23 revenues by $1.2 billion. So it was in September that the board really reflected the overattainment in fiscal 22 revenues that we just talked about. And the change here in December is considerably smaller. There's actually very minor changes to the estimate between September and December. The income tax went down a little bit. The lottery went down a little bit. They did not change the corporate income tax nor the sales tax. In the case of the corporate income tax, very late in the process of doing the revenue estimate in December, it became known that the year-to-date revenues from the corporate income tax had some serious issues. And so it was hard to know at that point whether or not the corporate income tax was tracking the September estimate, was coming in above, was coming in below. And the board decided to leave the corporate income tax alone and revisit this in March. They will next release an estimate in early March. The sales tax has been tracking the estimate from September. The board, I will say, made very small changes to their economic outlook in December, other than to change their estimate for capital gains income. And that's what really affects the personal income tax. In December, the board changed their capital gains forecast for tax year 22 from a decline of about 14% to a decline of about 19%. And in tax year 23 from a decline of about 9% to a decline of about 17%. So that's a pretty significant change. And that's what really impacts the personal income tax. In total, state and local net receipts were revised down by $325 million in fiscal 23 and $540 million in fiscal 24. The state collects both the state tax and the local tax together. But the impact on the general fund is considerably less than that. And that is because every December, the board revises their estimate of how much of the collections each fiscal year are for local income tax and how much are for the state income tax. And they do that based on the most recently available tax return data, which now is tax year 21. And that exercise of rebalancing their local share estimate resulted in a significant decline in the local share. And therefore it partly offset their overall revision to the income tax. This does not mean that the local government's going to get less than they're supposed to. It's just aligning the BRE's estimate to the actual local share as we see off of tax returns. And then the other changes here are pretty minor. The lottery in particular was mostly to align the revenues, again, with year-to-date performance. And that's all I have on both the economy and the revenues, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay, I don't see any hands. Let's just give it one more second, but I don't see any. So thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.
Rebecca Ruff is next.
Thank you. So what you see here is a summary of the closing balances, both in terms of cash balance and structural balance for the most recently completed fiscal year, fiscal 2022, through what's projected for the fiscal 2024 allowance. If you look at that box that's highlighted in the center of this chart, you can see that we are in a very strong position, both in terms of cash and structural balance as we completed fiscal 2022. Largely due to the overperformance of revenues, like Teresa said, strong contributions from the federal government helping to support that. We closed the year out with a cash balance just below $5.5 billion and a structural balance of about $3.6 billion. You can see from this chart that spending does increase considerably in the fiscal 2023 working appropriation. However, because of that sizable cash balance at the close of fiscal 2022 and continued strong revenue performance, we're projecting that we will close the current fiscal year with a balance of about $2.3 billion in cash and a still very, very strong structural position of $1.1 billion. As David mentioned early on in the presentation, the fiscal 2024 allowance, as introduced by the administration, leaves a healthy fund balance of $820 million and a strong structural position of $337 million, both of these in excess of the recommendations from the Spending Affordability Committee. Below that box, you see the line that provides the estimated fund balance for the rainy day fund, which does show that in fiscal 2023, the rainy day fund is projected to close with a balance that equals about 12.9% of general fund revenues and is drawn down to just even with 10% at $2.5 billion. Next slide.
So this slide provides information on the total deficiency appropriations provided in the budget for fiscal 2023. In total, they are $2.2 billion net of some planned reversions. $2 billion of that is in federal funds, with the remainder on general and special funds. So one of the drivers of the federal funds, it was mentioned earlier, with the extension of the enhanced Medicaid match, which produces general fund savings of about over $680 million and provides federal funds of the same amount. The next biggest area of deficiency appropriations is about $889 million in entitlements. Most of that is for Medicaid and behavioral health, and the majority of those are federal funds. The third largest area is in federal food assistance benefits, and that is both for regular benefits and some of the enhanced benefits that have been provided during the pandemic. About $370 million of that are for the summer benefits that have been provided in the summer. That includes both benefits that have been issued and that are expected to still be issued. The other area that I would highlight on this page is the 4.5% employee cost of living adjustment from November. That's about $250 million in total funds. If you go to the next slide. So this isolates just the general fund deficiency appropriations, which net to $186 million. The largest share of those, about just under $400 million, are healthcare provider reimbursement. So that's for Medicaid and behavioral health, but it also includes some additional funding for the developmental disabilities providers. The next biggest share is for debt service, just under $220 million. So this will support capital projects that were expected to be funded with bond premiums, but due to higher interest rates, those bond premiums won't be available. And so this provides general funds to replace that. And then again, the general fund deficiencies are largely offset by the savings produced by receiving the enhanced Medicaid match. When the budget was passed last year, it was not yet known that the public health emergency would extend into fiscal 2023. So the budget as enacted did not account for any of these savings. If you go to the next slide. So what this chart is looking at is the bars are the share of each of these groupings budget, that is general funds, special funds, and federal funds. The general funds are the yellow bars. And then the line is the kind of growth in that area of the budget in fiscal 2024 compared to fiscal 2023. Most of the areas of the budget increase and kind of generally within a small range, reflective of some of the personnel increases. You'll hear a little bit more about the local aid increases later. The one that I would highlight here is the health area, which includes the funding for the acceleration of those mandated provider rate increases, as well as the additional investments in behavioral health. Entitlement spending, both Medicaid and other entitlements, is projected to decrease as enrollment declines with the end of continuous enrollment provisions that were tied to those enhanced Medicaid, the federal Medicaid match, as well as the end of some of the enhanced benefits in the food stamp program, the SNAP program, and in general as the economy improves. If you turn to the next slide. So this slide looks at the areas of general fund change in the budget in fiscal 2024. About $771 million of that is in state agency operations. We'll get into a little more detail about that in a moment. The next biggest area, about $550 million, is in entitlements. Again, this is mostly due to backfilling those enhanced federal matching funds for the health areas. And then the next two biggest areas are the funds that are being reserved for transportation capital projects and the blueprint. These are largely, these are more than offset, I should say, by not depositing, making any additional deposits to the reserve fund, the rainy day fund, and then decreases in capital and debt service. If you go to the next slide. So this looks at the state agency spending, kind of excluding entitlements and local aid and capital. So the largest area of growth is in personnel, and that includes about $266 million for the COLA and increments that are being provided in fiscal 2024. An additional $70 million of that is also to annualize the 4.5% COLA that was provided in November. And there are a number of other changes as well, including new positions across state government, which you'll hear about in a moment. Most of the rest of these you've heard about in kind of other discussions. The areas of growth are partially offset by some one-time funding that was provided for legislative priorities. And you can go to the next slide. And Jason will begin with some personnel.
Thank you, Tanya. This slide shows data on vacancies in state government. As you can see at the bottom of the January vacancies column, there are 6,348 vacant positions in the executive branch of state government. This excludes higher education. That's 270 more vacancies than there were a year ago at this time. The vacancy rate in the executive branch is 13.1%. That's up from 12.6% a year ago. As you can see at the bottom of the budgeted turnover rate column, the fiscal 2024 allowance budgets for a 7.2% turnover rate, which is a little over half of what the actual vacancy rate right now is. That means the state government would have to fill nearly 2,800 positions just to get to the budgeted turnover rate. And then I would note that doesn't include nearly 600 new positions that have been added to the authorized workforce in state government, which I'll discuss in just a couple of seconds. And we can move on to the next slide. As both Tanya and Dave before me have mentioned, there's funding in the budget for statewide personnel actions, the November 22 cost of living adjustment, as well as a 2% cost of living adjustment in July of 23 and increments for fiscal 2024. The allowance also includes nearly $33 million for an annual salary review. Those are targeted salary increases to specific job categories that are particularly difficult to hire for. That's the largest annual salary review in recent memory. There's also a significant amount of funding for the SLEOLA salary increases, as well as bonuses for correctional officers. We move to the next slide. This chart shows the accumulation of recent salary increases since fiscal 2019. Prior to 2019, there have been 2 years without cost of living adjustments. But as you can see, there's now been 6 straight years of cost of living adjustments, as well as 3 straight years that included increments for state employees. The total in this time period is about 26% salary increases over the past over 6 fiscal years, ending in fiscal 2024. And we can move to the next slide. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, the fiscal 2024 allowance includes 576 new positions across state government across fiscal years 2023 and 2024. The largest portion of those positions are across several agencies, many related to legislation that was passed last year. In the Department of Natural Resources, there are 82 new positions to comply with the Great Maryland Outdoors Act, which added 90 positions to the Maryland Park Service. There are 69 new positions at the Maryland Department of the Environment to comply with enhanced water quality standard inspections. The Attorney General's Office, there are 57 new positions, including an expansion of the Medicaid fraud unit and the abuse and neglect unit. 43 new positions to reduce caseloads at the Office of the Public Defender. And then finally, I'd add there are 27 new positions for new agencies, 18 at the Department of Service and Civic Innovation, and 9 at the West North Avenue Development Authority. And you can advance to the next slide.
Okay, here you can see state funding to local governments will total around $10.3 billion in fiscal 2024. This represents an $848 million or 9% increase. Public schools will continue to receive the vast majority of state aid, with state funding totaling around $8.7 billion, and this represents a $733 million increase. Funding for county and municipal governments will total around $912 million, which is a $57.3 million increase. Funding for community colleges will total $476.3 million. Local health departments would get around $116 million, and local libraries would get around $92 million. The next page shows state funding by major programs. And here you can see that education aid under the major funding formulas increased by a significant amount this year. In particular, as stated earlier, state funding for the compensatory aid program will increase by around $391 million. This is a 30.2% increase, and it accounts for around 46% of the total state aid increase this year. This increase is due to a substantial increase in the number of students approved for free and reduced price meals, which serves as the enrollment count for the program. Whereas the full-time equivalent enrollment increases by around 0.5%, the number of students approved for free and reduced price meals increases by 34.2%. In several counties, the annual increase has exceeded 70%. And a chart showing the annual change in FTE and free and reduced price meal count is provided in the appendix, and it's Appendix 17. Other targeted education aid programs also increase. The English Language Learners Grant increases by 11.4%, and this results in additional $48.2 million in additional state support. The special education funding formula goes up by 15.7%, and this is a $62.8 million increase. In total, education aid and retirement payments accounts for around 87% of the state aid increase this year. Turning to community colleges, funding under the CADE formula is up by $38.2 million, and this represents a 10.8% increase. This increase is due to a relatively high increase in state funding at the four-year institutions of higher education. Funding per student under the program goes up by 18.5%. Student enrollment is actually going down by 6.5%. When you look at funding for local health departments, they're receiving an additional $14.5 million, which mostly reflects additional state support to cover salary enhancements for local health department employees. The formula component of the program, which is based on population growth and inflation, increases by only $5 million. At the county and municipal level, transportation aid increases by $56.7 million, which is a 19.2% increase. This accounts for the first year of a multi-year enhancement due to legislation enacted at the 2022 session. The state budget also includes $14.2 million in funding for the bus rapid transit system in Montgomery County. As you can see, public safety aid decreases by $5.6 million or 2.5%. This decrease is due to the elimination of several one-time only grants from the prior year. That was $5 million for the license plate reader grant and $1 million for cross-jurisdictional task forces. The state budget does include $1.3 million in additional funding for vehicle theft prevention. In addition, state funding for police aid will total $75.8 million, and the state budget also includes $45.9 million in enhanced funding for the police aid program. This will be the second year that the enhanced funding has been provided to local governments. The enhanced funding is allocated based on each county's share of total violent offenses. And finally, if you look at the disparity grant program, it increases by $5.3 million. However, of the 10 jurisdictions that receive funding under the program, 8 will realize a decrease in funding, while 2 jurisdictions will realize an increase in funding. And most of the jurisdictions that receive reduced funding this year is due to the elimination of the supplemental hold harmless grant that was provided last year. If you go to the next page, it basically shows state aid on a per capita basis and also as on a percent change basis. State aid per capita will average around $1,700 per resident, and it ranges from around $900 in Talbot County to over $2,800 in Caroline County. And this represents the state policy to provide greater financial assistance to local governments that have a lower tax base. Around 70% of state aid is allocated based on local wealth, which is measured by the local property tax base and the local income tax base. And finally, if you look at the chart below, it shows that most jurisdictions are receiving at least a 10% increase in their state aid this year. 2 jurisdictions are receiving increases below 5%, and only Allegheny County realizes a decrease in state aid in FY 2024. And this is due to the fact that their net taxable income has increased significantly this year due to one lottery winner. And whereas education aid has a hold harmless grant, there is no hold harmless grant this year for the disparity grant program. Additional charts which show funding on a county by county basis is available in the appendix. And I think we can now go to the Transportation Trust Fund.
Thank you, Hiram. This table on page 24 shows a comparison of the Transportation Trust Fund forecasts from January of last year compared to the January 2023 forecast. It only covers the 5-year overlap between the 2 forecasts. So we're talking 2023 through 2027. As you can see, from the comparison, total revenues are up by $1.5 billion compared to last year's forecast. Of that, $1.2 billion is coming in from taxes and fees, led by strong growth in the motor fuel tax revenue. That's due both to increased driving as the pandemic recovery travel increases, combined with the high price of gasoline that has been experienced over the last year. The second area of tax and fee growth that shows strong growth is in the corporate income tax. This is due to the 2022 legislation that was passed that increases the share of the corporate income tax going to the trust fund in order to offset the local aid piece that I'll talk about in just one second. Looking at the bottom of the table shows the expenditures, and there is the highway user grant capital grants increase by $731 million over the forecast for the 5-year period from last year. The second area of increase in the expenditure side is the operating budget portion, operating expenses, and this is driven largely by the increased compensation, the 4.5% COLA going forward into the future years, in the 2024 COLA as well. Also, just of note, in 2027, the operating portion of the availability payments for the purple line show up in the forecast. Go to the next slide, please. We now start talking about the Consolidated Transportation Program, or CTP. This is the capital forecast for the department. This chart shows that between last year's forecast and the current year forecast, again, only looking at the 5-year overlap, 2023 to 2027, total capital funding increases by $3.2 billion. And this pie chart shows the share by fund source. And the big federal increase is driven largely by the enhanced funding through the reauthorization of the federal surface transportation programs through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA. And there will be a chart on that later down in the presentation. And then the other next largest increase you can see there is the special funds, and that was driven by the revenue increases I just discussed. Go ahead and show the next slide. So this is the same $3.2 billion increase. It's shown by business unit, and you can see that the State Highway Administration receives 46% of the increased funding in the capital program. Again, that is directly related to the IIJA increase in the federal formula funding for highways and bridges. Next slide. The next two slides just look at the 2024 allowance compared to what was forecasted for 2024 last year. Total change between the two forecasts for fiscal 2024 total $641 million. It largely mirrors that 5-year forecast we just looked at with the pie charts. And next slide, please. And this is the same, again, looking only at 2024, the same $641 million increase between the two forecasts, showing it by administration. And again, this largely does mirror the 5-year totals. As you can see here, every business unit receives an increase in funding in the 2023 forecast compared to last year. And you can go on to the next session. That concludes the transportation.
Thank you, Steve.
Okay, this slide begins a look at the capital program, excluding the Maryland Department of Transportation program that Steve just went through. And this slide compares the proposed fiscal 2024 budget with that of the fiscal 2023 by major fund source and categories of use. The total budget of $3.6.2 billion, while it's $1.65 billion less than the current FY23 funding level. Fiscal 23 represented a historic level of capital funding, which itself was an increase over the $3.4 billion in fiscal 2022, which at the time was historical. To put that in perspective, prior to fiscal 2022, the capital program had not exceeded $2 billion. With respect to general funds, the budget includes a little over $1.205 billion of general obligation bond funds. This is consistent with the Spend Affordability Committee recommendation for the 2023 session. And while this looks smaller than the amount in FY 2023, the limit in 2023 was $1,165,000,000, so it's $40 million more than last year's net new. Fiscal 2023 included an additional $54 million of recycled bonds from deauthorizations. So it is $40 million more in net new over what was funded in fiscal 2023 with respect to GO bond funds. Next line, bond premiums. The budget does not include any bond premiums in fiscal 2024, and nor does the 5-year CIP project any fund capital support through bond premiums. Rising interest rates on the sale of state bonds have impacted the bond premium revenues. There's an inverse relationship between the interest rates and premiums. As interest rates go up, and they have, premiums go down to the point where the $260 million of bond premiums that were authorized to be used to support the capital program in fiscal 2023 are not projected to be realized. We're now looking at roughly $41 million. And this is where the roughly $219 million general fund deficiency that was previously discussed comes into play as a source of replacement funds for those bond premiums in 2023. And that's part of what increases the fiscal 2023 general fund level to close to 2.3 billion. And again, to put this in perspective, the capital program had increasingly been supported with bond premiums at 136 million in 21, roughly 222 in fiscal 2022, and then the 260 that was authorized in 2023, but now down to roughly $41 million. With respect to special funds, the increase is largely attributable to 310 million from the Fiscal Responsibility Fund. Roughly 270 million of that would be used to support school construction. The rest would go to other higher ed related infrastructure projects in the University System of Maryland and in community colleges. And there's a little footnote in the chart to discuss that. Special funds are also supported largely by the transfer tax. I've got a little bullet on that in a second, as well as the various revenues from the grant and loan programs, principally through the water quality and drinking water revolving loan programs and the housing and community development grant and loan programs. Federal funds go down considerably in FY24 compared to 23. And this is, again, is largely attributable to something David had mentioned earlier, which is the stimulus funds, which we've received in 2022 and 2023, principally in capital to support broadband infrastructure, the Healthy Schools Fund, and a few other environmental related programs. And those funds are going away and are not being reflected then in 24. And that is largely the reduction in the federal funds. And Built to Learn, the budget projects roughly $447 million of bond issuances in 2024. Thus far through fiscal 2022, 700 million of bond proceeds have been made available through 2 issuances to support Built to Learn. There have been no issuances against the 480 million authorized in 2023 thus far in 2023. Under the uses and sources, thank you. Again, there are a variety of puts and takes in a number of the different categories. I mean, again, this is largely attributable to the removal of one-time general funds, which supported the capital program in 2023, and the reduction of the federal stimulus funds also. And also something I'll point out later, which is 23 had a commitment to facility renewal, close to 200 million, which is not being repeated in fiscal 2024. Next slide. Thank you. So this just shows has some bullets on the authorization levels. And I'd said for fiscal 2024, the authorization level is consistent with the Spending Affordability Committee level for 2024. But in the out years, the CIP sticks to the $1,205,000,000 level through each year of the CIP. And the chart you see in the middle of the page just compares the 4 years in which the 2 CIPs overlap for the 2023 through 2026 session. And so for 2023, it's 80 million more than was planned in the CIP. And again, 40 million more than last year. But this reduces all the way down to 50 million by the time you get to 2026. So for the 4 years it overlaps, it's 260 million more than was programmed, but it's 290 million less than what the Spending Affordability Committee had recommended, with incremental 4% annual growth in each year. Again, holding the $1,205,000,000 level constant through the 5-year CIP. The next bullet, again, talks about the reliance on general funds, and this is where the administration, rather than increasing the bond authorization level in the out years, is continuing to rely on the strong cash position of the state and general funds, roughly 817 million for 2023. This compares to 457 was programmed in the CIP for fiscal 2024, so 360 million more. And overall, in the 4-year period, that would add 446 million above what was programmed last year to essentially counterbalance the holding of the GEO bond authorization level at the $1,205,000,000. the bottom of this slide and onto the next slide is a chart that talks about the transfer tax. Next slide, please. So you can see in the chart, transfer tax revenues, the revenues have been reduced by the Board of Revenue estimates in December. For fiscal 2024, that number is 286 million compared to 306, which was used in the fiscal 2023 budget. So roughly 20 million less. However, a significant overattainment of the revenue estimate used to support the fiscal 2022 budget of about 122 million adds to the additional spending for 2024. So while revenues are actually down to the capital programs by 20 million, there's actually roughly 43 million more of transfer tax revenues available to support fiscal 24 spending due to the large overattainment in fiscal 2022, which carries into 2024. The budget fully funds mandates. Roughly 353 million of capital mandates are in the capital budget. This includes an additional 200 million that was recently enacted or amended by the legislature in the 2021 and 2022 sessions, highlighted by roughly 130 million of mandated funding through the Great Maryland Outdoors Act for DNR-related, park-related infrastructure improvements. As I mentioned earlier, facilities renewal, which was a feature in the budget last year, is not supplemented in fiscal 2024. And I think this is largely attributable to the fact that the 110 million in general funds that were put in the dedicated purpose account for the Department of General Services remain in the dedicated purpose account, and the department has not begun to draw those funds down. And it highlights the inefficiencies still that exist in the operation of project management at the facility renewal level. And then lastly, school construction, almost $1.1 billion of funding, highlighted by 485 for the traditional program and roughly 447 for Built to Learn. And that's what I have for capital. Thank you.
The last few slides that we have for you today touch on the issue of federal funds, starting with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act funding that Steve had previously mentioned when he was discussing transportation funding. This legislation was signed into law in November of 2021. It was an issue of discussion in last year's budget considerations, but we didn't necessarily know that much at that time. We've been monitoring it over the past year. You might recall that in total, it was a $1.2 trillion investment in infrastructure across the country. We're estimating still that Maryland's expectation is about $8.1 billion in funding. About 70% of the state eligible funds that are expected to come through the IIJA are formula funds. And so, as Steve mentioned, a lot of that is the base transportation funding and the renewal of previous legislation that established the formula funding for transportation. But there is a considerable amount of enhancements that we are expecting. In total, transportation funding through IIJA equates to about 80% of the funds that Maryland is anticipated to receive through the legislation. All of these funds are reflected in the CTP. It does include about $1.4 billion in enhancements. There is also about $1.1 billion expected for investments in environment and water quality infrastructure. To date, we've identified just under $85 million in the fiscal 2023 and 2024 budgets. Those are the two largest pots. There is some smaller amounts of funding in the form of fiscal 23 deficiency appropriations and some funding in the allowance that relates largely to energy infrastructure. We're also aware of allocations with regard to broadband and cybersecurity and the disaster mitigation, but we haven't been able to necessarily identify funds in the fiscal 2024 budget. But I would note that this is anticipated funding over the next 5 years. So even if we don't see them in fiscal 2024, they could come in during the course of the fiscal year or the years beyond. The other significant piece of legislation that was enacted since you all met last session on the next slide is the Inflation Reduction Act. This went into law in August of 2002. There are several components of this legislation that are going to have an impact on individuals and companies in Maryland, but won't necessarily flow through the budget. What is of interest to your work on the budget is what currently FFIS is estimating to be about $88.5 billion in grants that could be of interest to the states. There is not a lot of information available yet, as the majority of funding through this act is actually competitive. To date, FFIS has identified allocations across the country totaling $8.7 billion. In total, about $61 billion is state eligible grant funding. And you can see from the chart in the middle of this slide that about 80% of that is competitive. So it will require state agencies to apply in order to receive funding. Only about $8.6 billion is formula funding. As of January 18th, we were aware of just under $140 million in allocated funds, although none of this funding is reflected in the budget currently. There's about $68.2 million provided through the Home Energy Performance-Based Whole House Rebate, $68.6 million for the High Efficiency Electric Home Rebate Program, and $750,000 related to air monitoring. The final slide we have for you is a list of the largest competitive grant programs. You can see that they target reductions for greenhouse gases, planning and implementation grants related to climate pollution reduction, neighborhood access and equity grants, the replacement of dirty vehicles, particularly heavy duty vehicles, with newer clean vehicles, as well as establishing zero emission vehicle infrastructure throughout the states, and a variety of other areas of funding. Both the Senate and House budget committees will be having briefings with regard to federal funds either today or tomorrow, where more information will be provided on this topic.
Mr. Chairman, that completes the DLS presentation. We certainly look forward to working with the committees over the next couple of months to work through the budget. And we're also happy to answer any questions anyone has. I was remiss in not mentioning at the start that we very much appreciated the new administration and the new Secretary of Department of Budget Management, Secretary Grady's willingness to share the budget data in sort of a timely way that had been done in the past, and made it possible for us to do such a detailed analysis so soon after the budget came out.
And we want to reiterate our thanks to you and Secretary Grady and you and your team, David, on turning this around in 5 days and getting this level of detail. I know it was a lot of work. So on behalf of Chair Gazzone and I, thank you very much for that. We do have a couple of questions, if that's okay. Delegate Corman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. David, I think this one's for you. I've been getting a lot of questions, as I'm sure you have, about question 1. And so I just want to clarify that nothing about question 1 changes the ability of the governor to submit supplementals going forward if they want to make changes in the budget, fund different priorities than what they were able to do in the 2 days they had the budget before submitting it. They can still follow that prior practice.
That is correct.
Okay, and they left a fund balance of $820 million, but that's several hundred million over the spending affordability target. So that's a potential source or other things they can come up with to do the typical supplemental process.
That's correct. Spending affordability had a $350 million fund balance goal. So there's a lot of room if the administration so chooses to spend more and still comply with spending affordability.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Delegate Henson.
Chairman, I believe my question is for Matthew. Looking at the capital budget, the housing and economic programs have one of the bigger differences from the FY23 budget. Are you able to provide any additional insight into changes there?
Yeah, there's a couple things going on. First, there's a decline in the federal recovery funds. A significant amount of money was put into broadband in FY23, 171 million of the 571 reflected in 23, for instance, is broadband funding. And so that's a significant component of it. And there are a couple other programs that received federal stimulus funds in DHCD that are not continuing into FY24. And just overall in general, the level of commitment to the housing programs compared to fiscal 23 level, when the legislature added additional funding as well to many of those programs in 2023, is down relative to in 2024 relative to the 2023 level. So there is some contraction in the program relative to 2023 and general funds and geo bond funds and special funds, but then there's also a significant reduction in federal funds, that are attributable to American Recovery and other federal stimulus funds.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Delegate. Don't see any other questions. So again, thank all of our participants. I want to remind the Appropriations Committee that we will have an in-person hearing at 3 o'clock, and please be on time as our speaker will be joining us. Chair Gazone, any final remarks?
No, just terrific team. DLS, thank you so much. As you've said several times, we're really excited about working with the administration. Secretary Grady has been absolutely terrific. And for our committee, it will be as soon as everybody gets back to the committee room, we'll begin bill hearings. So thank you all very much. It's terrific. Thank you.